Hey, what's up everybody? Now, have you ever thought to yourself, I spent basically 500 bucks on this Omnisphere instrument, and all I ever do is surf through the presets. They're great, but many times they're 20% not exactly what I'm looking for. But the interface is really intimidating. I don't know where to begin. I'm not even sure I know how to make the sound I'm imagining for my music. This tutorial, it will totally unlock all the potential that Omnisphere has for you and give you a lot of knowledge moving forward that you could apply to almost any other software or hardware synthesizer for that matter. So let's get right into it. Okay, so you'll notice a lot of people go into the interface and they click on layers and they tend to go through all these drop down menus. There's quite a lot here for all these different oscillator types you can pick from. But what a lot of people don't recognize is if I click on the tab right here for that part, you can also access those options here and use these arrow keys to change between them very quickly. But if you click sample, the window becomes empty. If I click on that empty window, it's going to bring me to the sound source menu. A lot of people that I've talked to in the past don't even know that this menu exists, and it's filled with tons and tons of stuff. The category system is probably the easiest way to get yourself around all these filters. You know, it's nice to use the adjectives on the right hand side, but generally speaking, the waveforms will give you more synthesizer type sounds. And usually by default, the autoplay is highlighted like this turned on, which is useful if you're just clicking and you want to hear what each wavetable sounds like. It's a bit loud though, and if you have your Midi keyboard turned on, it's helpful just to turn it off, and you can audition it by clicking really quickly there. And now that I have my Midi keyboard, I can just go around and check out all these waveforms. It's a pretty extensive selection, like a pretty long list of really classic synthesizers with a lot of very different kinds of sounds. So this is a great place to start to build a sound. And even if the sounds with a synthesizer are a little bit bright, I'm going to show you in about 2 seconds what you can do with it. But if you're not looking to just make a synthy type sound, there's so much more in this menu. So if you go to textures, these are a lot more cinematic sounding things. And then there's a lot of other stuff in here that fits kind of in a more general category, like the retro menu will be a lot of sounds and textures that you can bring into maybe something that's more tonal that's coming from here. But for now, we're just going to start with maybe something from the CS80, and then we're going to click on the X. So now it's applied that sound source into where normally it would just be oscillators. Now the next thing is, if you haven't learned about how to kind of organize getting around this menu, because there's a lot on it, you can really simplify it. If I go over here to the ADSR, this is your amp envelope. A lot of synthesizer sounds are very easy to create because the ADSR kind of dictates the principle of what the sound is. So for instance, right now, I kind of have your typical kind of synth keyboard kind of sound. If I was just to make the attack a lot longer and slower, like 5 seconds, for instance, you're going into a pad territory. And if you're on a Midi keyboard, you might want to turn the release up from its default to something above 1 second. So when you release the key, the sound drifts away more naturally. So now we've just created basically a pad. If you were to turn the sustain down and the attack back to a faster amount, you're kind of in that keyboard territory, which looks something like this. You can play around with this as much as you want, but it's pretty simple to go from there to a pluck by just simply turning the decay way down. The release can come down as well. And there you have a pluck. Notice how I haven't touched anything else on this screen, and we've already created a keyboard sound, a pad, and a pluck sound just from messing with the amp envelope. And if you go over here to the ARP and click on and turn the on button on, you basically have a pad. by just holding down the chord on your MIDI keyboard. And you can make these notes that you're adding to your sequencing longer by dragging this thing towards the right. And anytime you want to go out of arpeggiator mode, you just click on that on-off button. You're going to see that on-off button when you go back to your tab screen if you do want to change the sound a little bit. So let's say we want to go from a pluck to something else like a lead. Let's turn the sustain all the way up. And now we have kind of the essence of a lead sound. And this is a monophonic sound. So this is when you would go back to the main menu here. And in this left corner, you have voices. By default, it's set to 8 usually, I guess. So you would go to 1. You can see you can go up to 64, which is pretty amazing. It's kind of similar to Keyscape from Spectrasonics, where they're giving you a wide amount of voices that you can have in a patch. But in this case, we're just going to go down to 1 because a lot of lead sounds are monophonic. There's also some important stuff on this page that comes into play as well, like solo and glide. I click on these things and turn them on, and now when I turn this lever up a little bit, selects the amount of glide that's going to happen when I go from one note to the other using legato on the keyboard. And that's really useful for 808 sounds as well. If you want to have sliding 808s, right? You want to pay attention to this area right here. And so you can dial that in. And now it's sounding a little more like a lead, right? So now we have a lead sound, and it's pretty cool because if you wanted this to be more like a bass, in theory, you could just play down here on your keyboard and play lower notes. You notice it sounds a little bit messy because we are using that full amount of frequencies in this CS80 waveform. So now I just hit the on button for the filter. So you kind of have an 808-esque sound right at low C already just doing that. And it's kind of cool because we're producing this type of sound from a CS80 sound, right? So a classic synthesizer to create this bass type effect. And now we have a bass, right? Pretty cool. You can also check out this area here in the middle. So you have a lot of interesting things. Generally, I go for unison. It just pops up this menu, which you can always minimize with this button right here. And this is really cool because you can kind of quickly go into more of a Reese bass type territory. It's not exactly that, but you can kind of create a much more stereo sound to your bass. Here it is with it off. And you can play around with things like depth and spread. The detune is also really nice in this. You can even change the chorus, which gets more experimental because it's so much unison, right? The way this effects section is set up, at really only one point you can have 3 effects turned on at once. So let's say we turn off the ring modulation and head over to the harmonia section. I can turn this on and just add things like maybe 12 semitones up. Can add more depth to that bass sound, maybe 12 semitones down as well. But you can see in just a few minutes, we've gone from just picking something from the sound source menu to something that's actually got a lot of depth and character to it. And then essentially, if you go here to the main menu, you could just do this all over again. You could just do the same thing, adding on maybe a basic oscillator to this sound. You have your faders right here, or you could jump into that tab, check out the sound source menu, and stack things onto it. And like I said before, some of these other categories like psychoacoustic, SFX and noise, or the really cool distortion section are fantastic for adding on more layers and depth to your sound. So here I have Bad Dreams. If I go to main, turn off the one we were working on, got some wild stuff going on with it, dial it into the layer. And now all of a sudden you have a really, really unique sound that you can play with. That's kind of the workflow that's intended with Omnisphere. And like we talked about before, if you understand how to use envelopes, you can get there very quickly to whatever kind of sound you're imagining for your music. Another thing people don't know is you can right click over envelopes and it's going to give you this drop down menu where you can have saved ADSRs that you can actually just bring up all over again if you want to create them yourself. You also have different categories of other envelopes you can play around with. The default ADSR is fantastic. That's basically like a keyboard-esque sound that you can utilize. But let's say I'm happy with this ADSR and I want to utilize it when I'm using two different sound sources. Another thing that people might overlook is if you just right click and I go to copy envelope preset, go over to the other sound and paste envelope preset. And just like that, they're exactly the same. So it's much easier to blend those sounds together because their envelopes are not doing different things. Now, of course, there's situations where you want something like a multi-timbral sound where you have maybe your pad synth sound right here and a more lead synth sound right here. So they'd have opposing ADSRs, but that's a little more complex. So it's very easy to set the ADSR on your first sound source, copy and paste it over to the other one, and now they're going to combine together much easier. Now notice we haven't even talked about modulation or LFOs, and that is a big part of how you make synth sounds. If you guys want me to do a part 2 about doing this stuff in Omnisphere, I'm happy to do it, but I just want to keep this tutorial short to show you the workflow that keeps you from getting stuck with just the presets and not really feeling like you're getting everything out of the synth that it has to offer. If I go to the effects section, this is sort of the finishing off section of the synth. And if you explore these effects, there's quite a few of them, but generally they're really fun sort of coloring elements, I like to think of them as. You do have a pretty awesome 12-band graphic EQ right here, but you have to use your ear. So if you're not really interested in trying to set the EQ exactly the way you want it, you might be better off in using an EQ after Omnisphere. So this is a lot easier to kind of see the frequencies that are happening in your sound using something like this. An equivalent would obviously be EQ8 in Ableton, which has a very similar look to Pro Q from FabFilter. That's really useful for sort of setting the sound the way you want it. There's quite a few other things that you can do with Omnisphere, and this video is just scratching the surface, but there is a workflow that we've covered that hopefully will help you. Obviously, there's a ton of effects you can play around with, including reverbs and other creative effects. Those are really awesome, but I could always make another video about those things. And some people have been asking, can you load up your own custom sound sources when you're working in this software synth? And the answer is absolutely yes. So as vast as this menu is, you could load up your own as well, which makes Omnisphere incredibly deep for combining sounds together and making really unique stuff actually pretty quickly once you get used to the interface. So yeah, I hope this tutorial helps you. And if you have any questions, just leave them down below. If you want me to do a part 2 with this video where we talk about LFOs, modulation, different filter moves that you can do, I'd be happy to do it. And if you're new here, make sure you like and subscribe so I can kind of tell that people want to do more Omnisphere content. I love this synth. It's amazing. Even though I do a lot of stock, synthesizer stuff with Ableton on the channel, I love talking about Omnisphere and Serum. I think they're really fantastic tools for music producers. And if you're into checking out my stuff on Patreon, I have tons of stuff on there you can download for free. I'll put a link down below. We always have a great community over there, really supportive, talented people. And there's a lot of cool stuff to download as well. So be sure to check that out. I'll see you guys in the next one. Have fun making music.